whether you are male or female morphologically comes down to effectively a single switch that lives on the Y chromosome in humans. If that switch is present, you become male. If the switch is absent because you have two X chromosomes instead of a Y, you become female. But interestingly, if you have a Y chromosome and that switch is defective, you also become female. That's the default mode. And what that means is that it is perfectly conceivable for any human being watching or listening to this podcast that you could have an identical twin. That is somebody who shares your entire genome, but is of the opposite sex, based on whether that switch is added in or subtracted. That means it's not your genome being male, which takes a particular approach to sex. It is your genome being willing to play either role and being triggered into one set of strategies or another based on whether or not that switch triggers a developmental change. And I find this very powerful because it puts the lie to the idea that what happened to women was that men oppressed them. And in fact, it is certainly true that we do not choose our sex, and that historically speaking, whatever sex we were born into came with obligations and burdens that were special, that would have been absent had we been born the other way, right? If you are a woman, then reproduction is likely going to be an especially burdensome operation for you. If you're male, you run the risk of going to war. These are asymmetries. It's not clearly better to be one than the other. But in any case, the idea that every time a zygote is created, there is a lottery that dictates whether it's going to live its life as a male or a female, and that most of the genome knows nothing about how that lottery is going to work out until it's already happened. And then you play your role, just the same way if you're genetically endowed with genes that make you tall, you play that role. If you have genes that don't make you tall, then that's the life you live. It's just luck of the draw. But it isn't the story of, boy genomes oppressing girl genomes, and it never has been. That it's not to say that men have not oppressed women, but it's not a simple story of a genetic, of an evolutionary conflict between the sexes.
Yeah, I don't really believe in patriarchy. I mean, I think there are phenomena that we can describe as patriarchal, and there are clearly patriarchal cultures. But I think we need to assess those cultures in their own context and under their own material conditions. And when you do that, it's often fairly clear why it is that they came to be the way they are. It's pretty clear to me that the culture that we live in now is not patriarchal, and if anything, it's the opposite of patriarchal, in the sense that most of the obligations and the expectations and the strictures that are placed on men within a patriarchal culture are not heavily present now, for a whole host of quite complicated reasons. And yet, what I find fascinating is that hasn't stopped people talking about patriarchy, and it hasn't stopped women wanting to smash the patriarchy. And I puzzled over this for a long time, thinking, well, there isn't really one left to smash in any sort of, it's not as though, coverture is not a thing anymore. Women get to vote, in most ordinary contexts, there really is very little difference between the sexes. So what actually are women talking about here? And it came to me at last. I was reading a history of women and medicine. In some parts it was quite well researched, but the thing I found frustrating about it was that every time something came along that the author didn't like, she would blame it on patriarchy. So, for example, let me see, the fact that male doctors didn't want to get involved in childbirth was patriarchal. But then when male doctors wanted to get involved in childbirth, that was them pushing out the female midwives, and that was also patriarchal. And there were a whole lot of instances. And I was reading this, and I was thinking, well, you can't really have it both ways. These things can't all be patriarchal. Anesthetizing women who are giving birth isn't patriarchal if not anesthetizing women who are giving birth is also patriarchal. That doesn't make sense. So which is it? And I came to the conclusion that, in fact, what she meant in aggregate, what the inference over the course of the book was that what she meant by patriarchy was immutable sex differences. That really, and ever since then, every time I come across a modern day usage of patriarchy, I experiment to see if I can substitute it out and have it make more sense if I replace it with immutable sex differences that I don't like. And I have yet to find a contemporary instance of the word patriarchy which can't be better replaced and more coherently replaced with immutable sex differences I don't like.
No, I think,
and I mean, there are plenty of situations where I don't like the immutable physiological, morphological female form that I have. There are times it's annoying and frustrating, but it's not patriarchy.
Yes, I think you have this one exactly right. And in fact, I have made this exact point that patriarchal is real, patriarchy is a fiction. And you're also correct about the immutable characteristics, right? Yes, it is oppressive that women are disproportionately called upon to feed infants, but it wasn't men who did that, right? If it was anything about maleness, it happened so many hundreds of millions of years ago that it had nothing to do with a creature that had any culture at all, right? It was just simply an imbalance that caused, we call it anisogamy, that basically once you have a set of gametes that is disproportionately invested in the survival of offspring, it causes the other set of gametes to cheap out. And that has consequences that continue to echo into our current form. But, it wasn't men who had anything to do with it. There were no men. It was some biological truth in the universe that is so deep, we even see that asymmetry in plants, which inherited it from someplace different. So anyway, yes, I wish people would not leap to the conclusion that everything was so human-centric that to the extent that they feel burdened by something that has something to do with sex or gender, that it must be the other sex or gender doing it. That's just not the case. So anyway, I agree with your formulation completely.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, I remember. What came to mind for me there was a moment shortly after my daughter was born. As I'm sure you know, newborns go through phases of cluster feeding because they want to bring up your milk supply so they can grow, which basically means that you're stuck there under a feeding newborn, sometimes for hours at a time. It hurts. It's not especially fun. I mean, it's not the moment of radiant motherhood, which is idealized in 1,000,001 images. It sucks. And I remember sitting there literally crying under a cluster feeding infant, and my husband bringing me a glass of wine and a cheese sandwich, because that was, and just being, brave Mary, and, please carry on, and I wish I could help, but I can't. And just, that was what came to mind. It wasn't his fault that he couldn't help. This is just how humans are built, and this is just what looking after a baby is. That's just one part and parcel of it. If you happen to be this sex rather than that sex, and I guess I could have felt angry with him if I'd been feeling extremely postpartum and unreasonable. But it didn't. I wasn't being oppressed in that way, except just by my own physiology, and that's certainly not the fault of the patriarchy. That's just the shape humans are.
Yep. I remember a moment late in one of Heather's pregnancies where she looked at me. She had anger in her eyes, but it was clear that it wasn't at me. And she said, "This is a goddamn stupid way to reproduce."
Many women have said a version of that at one time or another whilst growing new humans.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
I happen to know that she had marsupials on her mind at the moment, thinking that they had a smarter way of doing it. But
they had it all figured out.
Well, I don't know about all figured out, but certainly better figured out.